Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day number 1101, 1101. April the 22nd, 2020, Wednesday. Okay, so, well, it is Wednesday, so you know what happens on Wednesday. Of course, I take out the trash and I have some chicken. And tonight, of course, I'll be having some chicken and taking out the trash. I haven't decided what kind of chicken. Let's see, I'm considering maybe I'm thinking maybe some Chinese. Oh, no, that's right. They closed the Chinese restaurant up the street from me here, so I can't have Chinese. I guess I'll figure it out. In the meantime, let's talk about the news of the day. Let's see. All the news today, fortunately, is all about Spygate, Russiagate, whatever you want to call it, the coup. Good news here. We're not going to talk about any coronavirus. You can get that anywhere. We're not going to talk about any politics. We're kind of sick of that. You know that's the same old anyway. Let's go ahead and talk about the newest information coming out regarding the coup and things and such. Okay, so before I get into some of the new information or what have you about Russiagate, over the past week and a half or so, this new narrative since the declassification of the footnotes, which revealed that FBI analysts believe that some or possibly all of the so-called Steele dossier was Russian disinformation. Russian disinformation. I just can't. I just can't buy that. I don't know what it is. It's not working for me. Something in my mind is saying reject, reject, reject. It's just not going down, if you know what I mean. I keep regurgitating this. Something is telling me that there's something wrong with this narrative. So over the past couple days, I've given you reasons why I think that, but there's a real simple reason that I haven't even brought up. And again, it's not getting into the details of this and that and the other. It's really kind of a forest for the trees, big picture sort of thought that you have sometimes. It's usually the most simple explanation that's the most correct, and the one that we usually are the last to arrive at. You have to go through all these little details and explore something to death before finally the big picture smacks you in the face. So I'm sitting back yesterday taking notes for today's video and thinking about this, and it just dawns on me that in order for this to have been a Russian disinformation campaign, that would mean that the Russians would have had to have believed that the FBI, CIA, whoever, the American government officials, investigators, what have you, they would have to have believed the bullshit in the dossier. They would have had to have believed it. And how likely is it that these really high-level, top-notch Russian intelligence people, who are not stupid by any stretch, in fact, we know that when it comes to intelligence, the Russians are as good as anybody, and they're not naive. They would have to have been terribly naive to put together something like the Russian dossier or to feed someone this type of disinformation and actually believe that it would pass the sniff test with the FBI. Because they would have to assume that the FBI would get this information and go, this is interesting, I wonder what this is. And they would look at the claims made in the dossier. And an average FBI agent with an internet connection, access to government databases, would be able to debunk pretty much everything in the dossier in about one day. One simple record search could have showed them, passport search would have showed an FBI agent that the claims about Cohen were untrue. A little bit of digging with their friends and various intelligence agencies in the West would have told them that Carter Page was not a Russian asset, but was rather an asset for the FBI and even the CIA itself. So an FBI agent's not going to know that Carter Page, just less than 6 months ago, helped them bust up a Russian crime ring. And you don't think an FBI agent would figure that one out in about an hour? They have his long career. He was in Navy intelligence. They have no reason to believe that he's ever done anything like this before. They know that he's an energy consultant and works in Eastern Europe. They have all this information about Carter Page. And when they actually get the Carter Page FISA warrant, he's no longer even working for the campaign as an unpaid advisor. And what is it that they go look at when they get the FISA? Everything that happened during the 2016 election, 2016, 2017, up to the current moment. They go back in time on Carter Page, but they only go back to like the election. If they were really looking for him to have had ties with Russians or something else, they would have gone back much farther than that. Any FBI agent would have sniffed out the Carter Page thing in about an hour. Maybe a day, tops. In other words, they could go down through the dossier just as the FBI did. I mean, the FBI analyst in January did say, okay, let's make a spreadsheet. Let's put down every claim made in the dossier and let's see if it proves true. And from what we understand, they were able to disprove about 90% of it, and the other 10% couldn't prove or disprove. That's what they were able to do. And that's exactly what the Russians would have thought. The Russians would have said, well, let's see what you come up with. Let me see. Yeah, Cohen in Prague, Carter Page is working, he's going to get a 15% cut in a multi-billion-dollar company. Yeah, that won't look bad. And any senior Russian intelligence official, even if they wanted to do a disinformation campaign, would have looked at that dossier and said, this ain't going to pass a sniff test for even 24 hours at the FBI. They'll laugh at this. We'll look stupid. Throw this thing in the garbage. Get some real quality people on this thing. That's what the Russians would have concluded. The Russians would never have believed that the FBI would be duped by something as effed up as the dossier. Something as unprovable as the in fact, something that could be, for the most part, as the FBI proved, could 90% be proven to be false. So we have to assume that the Russian intelligence services are that stupid that they would believe that the FBI would be duped by the dossier. And that just isn't very likely. The Russians are not that stupid, and they know that our FBI is not that stupid. Our FBI wasn't duped, nor would they have been. And they proved it because they did put together the spreadsheet in January and debunked 90% of what was in the dossier. Hell, Kathleen Kvalik with Steele sitting in her office right there when he said, yeah, and the Russians have an embassy down there in Florida. She debunked that right while she was sitting there talking to Steele and sent the memo ahead. Hey, you might want to question this Steele guy. Some of the stuff he's saying is just, it's crazy. It's not true. I mean, the dossier was so flimsy, the media, though they were sitting on it for months from the middle of the summer all the way through the election period and all the way through the first of the year, would never actually report on it because they knew they'd get sued. It was so bad that they had to lie about it to the FISA court and continue to lie about it to this day. That's how flimsy and weak the dossier was. Yet we're supposed to believe that Russian intelligence thought that it would be good enough to dupe the FBI. You see, it doesn't work out, does it? This wouldn't even work in a really bad spy movie. This wouldn't work in a really bad spy book or anything else. No one would believe this. It's complete garbage. Yet that's what they want us to believe, that the Russians actually thought that the FBI would look at the dossier and think, whoa, this is good stuff. Man, oh man. Hey, let's run with it. And never really check it out. Now, of course, that's exactly what they did because they were out to get Trump, but not because the Russians created it as a disinformation campaign, but because the deep state was working with the Rotten Reverend Clinton campaign to deep six Trump and take him out before he could be elected. And then once he was elected, then they had to cover it all up. That was what the Mueller investigation was all about. The Mueller investigation was not about finding Trump-Russia collusion. He knew that was bullshit from day one. But he also knew that all the evidence that we're now getting that would prove the coup had to be protected. And that was his primary objective. Because every time either the Goodlatte Committee, Goodlatte-Gowdy Committee, or one of the other committees that were investigating this would try to request documents for the hearings that they were having, Rodenstein would just send them back a letter saying, sorry, that interferes with the Mueller investigation. Can't have it. So that's why Uncle Bob was there, to protect the evidence that could be used to prove the coup. That was his number one objective. And in the process, to try to anger Trump enough that he would do something that they could use as an obstruction of justice accusation, which would then be passed over to the Congress so that they could do their impeachment. And of course, a big emphasis was placed on keeping this going until the midterm elections so that they could win back the House so that they could do the impeachment. Even if they couldn't close the deal in the Senate now, if they'd have won the Senate, they would have closed the deal. And Trump would be impeached right now and probably removed from office. Holding on to the Senate turned out to be a very, very good idea. Now, that's basically the long and short of it. The disinformation campaign requires all of us to believe that the Russians, the Russian intelligence services, would have to have believed that the FBI would have been duped by the dossier. And it's a joke. It's a joke. Even Putin laughed at it. Many other Russians. Deripaska laughed at it when the FBI came and knocked on his door at his hotel. Hey, you want to help us with this Trump-Russia collusion? He laughed. Before he ever heard a single word of evidence, he laughed at him. You're crazy. No one's going to believe that. That's bullshit. Leave. And who was it that sent those FBI agents over to see Deripaska? Andy McCabe. So, that's just another one of many reasons why I'm not going to swallow the Russia disinformation line. It's not going to work. Not on me. You all can think what you want about it, but me personally, I'm not going to choke that one down. I'm sorry. I'm going to regurgitate it. They can have it back. I'm not buying it. Now, let's move on to the next thing. Well, we had the Gateway Pundit with a couple of good stories yesterday. One story they had was, of course, this is an email conversation, a text or email that we've talked about many times before, coming from the lovebirds at the FBI, Peter's Been Stroking Us, and the Lisa Page, where there's an email that suggests that the Obama administration, that the Obama FBI, knew that Senator Magoo, the late Senator Magoo, John McCain, leaked the phony Russian dossier. And of course, now Judicial Watch has acquired another 138 pages of emails. And of course, that email is now in much better context because a lot of the other emails around it we didn't have, and a lot of it was redacted. Now Judicial Watch has got 138 pages, so we get a little more insight into this email conversation between Peter's Been Stroking Us and Lisa Page. But basically the main thing to focus on here in this series of emails between Strzok and Page is the following. When Peter's Been Stroking Us emails Lisa and says, quote, "Our internet system is blocking the site, but it's 25.6 megabytes. Comparing now. The set is only identical to what McCain had. It has differences from what was given to us by David Corn and Glenn Simpson." So what they're talking about is the fact that, remember, there were many different, well, I say many, but several different versions of the dossier because it was in memo form. And so when Christopher Steele provided the memos to the FBI as they're collecting these memos prior to him doing the last one, he was giving these memos to the CIA and they were kind of collecting them until they became the whole dossier. But in the case of Senator Magoo, he had his right-hand man, David Kramer, fly over to London, meet with Steele, and said, okay, well, go back home and I'll send a copy over to Simpson and I'll make sure he gets a copy to you and McCain. So what they ended up getting, McCain ended up getting the whole dossier with all the memos together, including the final one, which Peter's Been Stroking Us and Lisa Page had not yet received. So McCain got an extra memo, and there may have been some other differences, but clearly what Strzok is telling Lisa Page is that the dossier that was released by BuzzFeed, and they're viewing it as they're looking at it as it's released, Peter's Been Stroking Us is looking at it and telling Lisa Page, hey, this is not exactly the dossier that we got. There's some differences here. and he goes on to point out things that are different from what they got. So, so this tells us a couple things. Number one, it just tells us how the dossier was moved around and passed around and who got what and when they got it. But it also tells us that that the FBI knew that it was Senator Magoo who leaked this information to BuzzFeed. That's essentially what Peter's been stroking us as saying here, because he's talking about the BuzzFeed release of the dossier, and he immediately refers to Senator Magoo. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, oh, the one that Magoo leaked to BuzzFeed is different than the one that Glenn Simpson and David Korn from Mother Jones gave to us. Not to mention the fact that Steele was passing off these memos in memo form, the dossier in memo form, to this agent over in Rome, Mike Gatta. He was also providing information to Jonathan Weiner, going through the State Department. And of course, we have new revelations now that there was that the information, this just came out yesterday, that the information now they're looking at this Carter Page FISA, and they're discovering that the main piece of information that they used in that first Carter Page FISA, they attributed to the State Department, corroborating what the FBI had been getting. Of course, what they don't realize is that it was coming from the State Department, but it was coming from Jonathan Weiner, who was being fed by Sidney Blumenthal, Hillary's boy, and Cody Shearer was the one who gave that information to Blumenthal. So Hillary's henchman, Shearer, comes up with this garbage, gives it to Blumenthal. He passes it to Weiner. Weiner goes through Newland to see if it's okay, and then passes it on to Steele. Steele then passes it on to the FBI. So this is what's being pointed out, and that information that came through Weiner, through Blumenthal, through Shearer, is what was really, they attribute to being the sort of confirmation to the FBI coming from the State Department. So you can see now that the State Department is now, although it's been under the, it's been under the microscope for quite some time as far as we're all concerned, but as far as the media is concerned, they've stayed away from that. Maybe because it begins to take you down the road of the rotten Reverend Clinton, because all those State Department people were Hillary Clinton holdovers from her State Department after she served in Obama's first term. Those were all Hillary Clinton's State Department assets, as was Jonathan Weiner. So, but that's just another news story that came out yesterday. So you can bet that now Durham, if he hasn't already, will be focused a lot more looking at the State Department and how information was moved and pipelined through there. And that's critical because it's the reason now that they're saying that it was the solidifying piece of evidence that allowed them to go forward to the FISA court. The FBI had their garbage, but they needed corroboration. And it was the State Department who they believe gave them that corroboration, even though, as it turns out, it was still the same source. Just the same thing as with the Yahoo News article. They say, well, this is other corroboration. Not really. It was all Christopher Steele. It's Christopher Steele being fed by Weiner. It was Christopher Steele who fed Yahoo News. It was all going back to the same people and all being fed to the FISA court, and they're pretending it's coming from all these different sources when it's all coming from the same sources. That's the bottom line there. But anyway, yes, this shows that Strzok and Page knew that it was McCain who provided the dossier to BuzzFeed. Now, how would they know that? How would they know that? Well, they would know that clearly because they were likely in communication with Glenn Simpson of Confusion GPS. And of course, during this time was also when Bruce Orr was briefing the DOJ 11 different times. He went and briefed the DOJ. And of course, Glenn Simpson certainly would have told Bruce Orr this. Of course, Bruce Orr and Nellie met with Steele themselves. I think it was just before the election. Met in Washington, had breakfast with Christopher Steele. So, I mean, they all knew where all this information was coming from, and they knew who was getting what and who was doing what. They knew it all. There was no secrets among these thieves. Well, we have some very interesting information now coming out because of the book that's been written by this Australian high level government official in Australia. Um, and he's just written this book. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. And so there's some really interesting information in here. Some we know, it's new, regarding Alexander Down the Hatch Downer and John Durham. So according to, and his name is Trumbull, this Australian politician named Trumbull has written a book where he talks about what he knows about, and he was one of the top heads of government at the time. He would have known all these things. So he writes in his book all these things about what he knows about the Downer, situation with Papadopoulos and Durham and all this, and it's in his book. And so the Washington Examiner has honed in on a couple of points. So let me cover a couple of those with you now. So we know that Durham went to Australia to interview, we assumed at that time, Downer and maybe Australian government officials. But as it turns out, Downer was not in Australia when Durham went there. So Durham did talk to some Australian government officials there, but not Downer. But he did talk to Downer, but it was in London. So we find out that Durham was in London at the end of 2019. And while there, he did view the cable that Downer sent to Australia, to Canberra, in May of 2016. Also, Durham interviewed in London Downer's assistant, Erica Thompson. Downer's assistant, Erica Thompson, who's the one who set up the meeting, which was attended by her and Downer with Papadopoulos. Now, Downer did meet with Durham, and the Australian government said, yeah, that's okay. You can meet with Downer, just as long as it doesn't, whatever information you get stays within the FBI. We'll see how that works out. So Downer did meet with Durham in London, and he is said to have told Durham's investigators that he was not part of a conspiratorial plot to undermine Trump. That's bad news. If you have to even discuss whether you were part of a conspiratorial plot to undermine a president, that's pretty serious business. Now, they don't believe him. They know he's lying. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because of the recent release from the Senate Judiciary Committee where Graham releases everything, including the letter that he wrote to Australia, where Lindsey Graham makes no bones about the fact. He doesn't ask. He's not suggesting. He is stating a point. Go read the letter for yourself. It's quite short. It takes 2 minutes to read it. It's very to the point. Lindsey Graham is saying, hey, as head of the Judiciary Committee, we are looking into the events of 2016, the election meddling. There is now a current investigation by U.S. Attorney John Durham, fully endorsed by the Attorney General Barr. We're going to get to the bottom of this, and I expect your cooperation. Expect your cooperation. And he says, what we really need to find out is who was it that told Downer to connect with Papadopoulos. He doesn't say we need to find out if Downer was instructed to meet with Papadopoulos. No. He says very matter-of-factly, we need to find out who instructed Downer to meet or make contact with Papadopoulos. They know that someone instructed him. And as I said, it's either Bill Priestap or Stefan Halper. One of those two, and there's an outside shot that it was direct from Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton, one of those two, because they know him, especially Bill Clinton, personally, very close to Downer. So, but the Clintons rarely do that kind of stuff on their own. They rarely leave their fingerprints at the scene of the crime. They always use surrogates and intermediaries and other people to do their dirty work for them. That way they can maintain plausible deniability. So there you go. Downer was interviewed by Durham and his investigative team in London in late September 2019, along with his assistant Erica Thompson. And of course, we're being told here from Mr. Trumbull's book that Downer told Durham that he was not part of any conspiratorial plot to undermine Trump. Now, you can take that a couple different ways. Could mean that he was not aware that he was part of a conspiratorial plot. Doesn't mean that someone didn't instruct him to meet with Papadopoulos. It just means that he doesn't feel like he was part of a plot. Doesn't mean he wasn't instructed by somebody to do it. In other words, what he would be saying is that I didn't know what I was involved in as I was doing it. Yeah, Halper just called me and said, hey, man, this guy Papadopoulos, he just wrote a news article, man, where he's really coming down on David Cameron. You should have lunch with him and give him some shit about it. Oh, and while you're doing it, when you get done after the meeting, go tell the embassy that he told you that the Russians have dirt on Hillary. And there'll be a nice $2,000 in an envelope waiting for you when you do that. So, yeah, I no one in the right mind believes that it was pure coincidence that Alexander Down the Hatch Downer would just decide to have his assistant call Papadopoulos and arrange a dinner meeting or arrange to have some drinks and have a conversation so that Downer could bust Papadopoulos' balls over an article he wrote where he criticized David Cameron. No one believes that. It's stupid. And when you look at the connections, he's connected to Halper, the Clintons. He's totally hates Trump. He's a pro-Clinton guy. He's a high-level diplomat who would never even waste his time on someone like a Papadopoulos. Whoop-de-doo, he wrote an article where he said that David Cameron should apologize to Trump for comments he made. And the circles that Downer runs in, talk about punching down, he wouldn't even waste his time. It would be like, a Major League Baseball player who's in a slump responding to some guy on a YouTube video with 40 subscribers, criticizing him. Would the Major League Baseball player want to waste his time talking to someone who has a small little YouTube channel who's criticizing him because he's in a slump? Of course not. That's what we're talking about here. Why would Downer even bother? I mean, no one even knows who Papadopoulos was. Nobody even heard of him before. He's a low-level staffer for the Trump campaign. Whoop-de-doo. A lot of people make comments about those comments that Cameron made. Not just Papadopoulos, many people commenting on that. No, there was a setup. Halper told Papadopoulos to write that article in the paper so that it would make it in the paper, knowing good and well he was going to express his feelings about what Cameron said. And Halper was just waiting for the article to hit the paper, and he probably made sure that it got released very quickly. And, of course, then he calls down and says, okay, the article's out. Now make your appointment with Papadopoulos and go sit down and follow the plan. So Downer may be able to say that he wasn't part of a conspiratorial plot to undermine Trump, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't contacted and told to sit down with Papadopoulos and have a conversation with him about the David Cameron article. Someone motivated Downer. He didn't do this on his own. It doesn't make any sense. No one's going to believe it. I know Durham doesn't. I know I don't. I'm pretty sure most of you don't. Total bullshit. Downer contacted Australian officials after Trump was named the GOP nominee on July 19th of 2016. So in May, Downer has this conversation with Papadopoulos. About 2 months later, July 19th, Trump becomes essentially the nominee for the Republican Party, wins the primary, and the very next day, Downer is contacting an Australian government official. But nothing really happened after he contacted that government official, and so he went over to the U.S. Embassy in London, walked in, and told Elizabeth Dibble all about it. And then she passed it on through her channels, and it made its way into the FBI. And, of course, we learned yesterday that this Australian government official now says that what Downer did was not in keeping with policy and procedure for Australian diplomats. He violated, the procedures. He should never have gone to London to give this information to Dibble, and he didn't follow the proper channels. So he's kind of being called out in this book, and that's what we know. So Durham has interviewed both Downer and his assistant, Erica Thompson. That happened in London in late 2019, and of course Downer gave him some bullshit, which of course Durham doesn't believe. You can bet on that. We also had a very interesting interview yesterday with Attorney General Barr with Hugh Hewitt. And in that interview, Hugh Hewitt brings up a point that I hear from time to time people talking about, which is, well, Durham has to indict these people before we get into the general election, because once we get in the general election, you can't indict anybody because there's some rule at the Department of Justice saying that you can't indict people because it interferes with the political process during an election. So people are saying if he doesn't do it by a certain date, when the general election begins, and he can't do it till after the election. So Hugh Hewitt hits Attorney General Barr up on that point, at which point Attorney General Barr suggests to Hugh Hewitt a couple of things. Number one, he says, well, I'm not sure of the exact wording as to, the time, how much time out from the election that we're talking about here, but I think we'd be talking about days. He said the point was to make sure that it couldn't be used as a late October surprise in a presidential campaign. So late October, a week or two before the election, the DOJ doesn't want to drop an indictment on a presidential candidate or a governor candidate or a Senate candidate or something like that. And that moves, so Barr's, no, it's not like months and months and months before. It's meant to be more like a couple weeks before an election. And he said it also only applies to a person running for high office. So in other words, and then of course Barr tells Hugh Hewitt, he says, and by the way, as far as I know, John Durham's investigation isn't targeting anybody running for president, meaning Biden or Trump. So as far as Barr is concerned and Durham are concerned, Comey, McCabe, Rice, Strzok, Page, Brennan, Clapper, they're all fair game. He can indict them on election day. They're not running for office. So their Barr clarifies for all of us what his thinking is on this DOJ rule. It's not a law, it's a rule. It's a practice more than anything else. And but Barr says that only applies to the person running for high office. And so apparently, he's saying that Durham isn't looking at either of the candidates at this point, any of the people running for president. They're not in the crosshairs of Durham's investigation. But even if they were, he doesn't think it's like months and months and months before the election. He thinks it's more like days, maybe a week or so, to avoid an October surprise. So there you go. That's what Barr is telling Hugh Hewitt. We had this funny letter from Rick Grinnell. The bug-eyed fool, Adam Schifferbrains, sent this letter to Rick Grinnell because he was pissed off about Grinnell firing ICIG Atkinson and also firing all these people in the intelligence community, moving them around, forcing them into retirement, bringing in new people, making a lot of changes. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of firings, there's a lot of movings around going on, forced retirements and things like that going on right now in the intelligence community because Rick Grinnell is over there kicking ass and taking names with Posh Cattell helping him identify the deep staters. They're getting the deep staters out. So Schiff writes a letter where he complains about the firing of Atkinson, and he says he doesn't think it's appropriate that Grinnell, because he's only the acting ODNI. He says because you're only the acting ODNI, you shouldn't be pursuing additional leadership changes, organizational or staffing changes because you're temporary. At which point, Grinnell writes this letter back to Schiff and says essentially, I must disagree with your proposals to divest the DNI of managerial competence and personnel decision-making authority, and to replace your committee's mandate for the intelligence community oversight with a mandate for IC administration. And, here's the good part, going forward, I encourage you to think of the relationship between your committee and the intelligence community as that between the legislature and the executive branches of government, rather than between a hedge fund and a distressed asset, as your letter suggests. In other words, Rick Grinnell telling Schiff to go pound sand. He'll fire anybody he wants. He'll put in anyone he wants, take out anyone he wants. It's none of Schiff's business. Pound sand, fool. Senator Richard Burr yesterday released the Senate Intelligence Committee report that they've been holding on to for months and months and months and months and months. And believe it or not, they're actually releasing his report concluding that Russia did, in fact, aid Trump in the 2016 election.